Right, joining us right now is Pranjul Bhandari, Chief Indian Economist at HSBC. Thank you very much for joining us. The first question that we ask most of our guests as we build up to the union budget is their expectations. So, number one, what is your opinion on the Indian economy? How does that reflect? And what do you think should be that one or two crucial things that the budget must concentrate on?
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. So look, I think the most important thing right now is to understand that the global economy is very fragile, it's very uncertain, and it is slowing. And India will have to slow as a result. When you think about how India has grown since the pandemic, a bulk of the growth has come from exports. But today exports are slowing around the world, and therefore GDP growth in India must also slow. So I think that is the context, that is the backdrop in which the budget is being made. The budget has two options. One is to take steps that increases growth, but the other option is to focus on macro stability, low price rise, low inflation, lower trade deficit, so the rupee will remain more stable, lesser fiscal deficit, so government doesn't borrow everything in the market, leaving nothing for the private sector. These are indicators of macro stability, and my sense is that this government and this budget will choose macro stability over growth. They will in a way say that, look, growth is going to be weak. We cannot help it. It's a global phenomenon. At least let's make sure that India's macro stability is intact so that when tomorrow the global environment becomes better, India will be in a very good place to take off. And what this means tomorrow in terms of numbers is that we think a lower fiscal deficit, will come forth. So we think the government is going to bring down the fiscal deficit from 6.4% to 5.8%. That's a little troubling for growth, but it's the right step at this point in my view.
You mentioned a very important point on keeping the inflation low, but we know that obviously, given the challenges that you see in the subcontinent, the situation is far more contained and arrested and controlled in India. But still, it is on the higher side. So, what are those things that the government can do, according to you, to keep this in check?
Yeah, I think both the central government, the government and the Reserve Bank of India need to play a role to bring down inflation and make sure it's not very high. What the government can do is to make sure that food prices don't rise very quickly. Much more nimble sale, purchase, much more nimble transportation of food items across states, much more nimble export imports of shortfall item. I think all of these things the government will have to keep doing. And to be very honest, this government has done a decent job in on that front and keeping a lid on food inflation over the last couple of years. So that is one part. But then there's another part. There's a part of inflation which is non-food, non-fuel inflation. It is everything else we do. The clothes we buy when we go out to work, or we go watch a movie, or children go to school, all the other cost of living. And I think that is something which, in a way, the central bank, the RBI, will have to manage by keeping rates higher and basically slowing growth in a way that prices come off. So there is a trade-off. If you want lower inflation, you have to also live with slightly lower growth. And I think this is the year to focus on lower inflation, lowering it rather than becoming greedy for higher growth.
Ms. Bhandari, you see, today the economic survey has been released. I'm sure you must have seen the key findings of the survey. What, according to you, are the key markers as far as this survey is concerned? For instance, it pegs growth between 6 to 6.8%. That's the projection. Do you think that's a decent expectation, fair expectation? Are we undervaluing? How do you look at this percentage?
I think for FY24, a growth number of 6.5 is a bit too high. My own sense is it will be closer to about 5.5%. And the reason is what I mentioned. That A, global economy is very uncertain, exports are slowing. Then B, we have our own domestic issue. The fact that we came out of the lockdown with a huge amount of pent-up demand. But we've taken our second holiday. We've gone to that restaurant. We've done that activity which we hadn't done. Now, the force of pent-up demand is going to be weaker from here. And then the final point is that, look, we are in a period in which inflation is high. So the RBI is raising rates to bring it down. The central government is trying to bring down the fiscal deficit. All of that does take a toll on growth. So my sense is growth will be lower. Instead of 6.5, it will be 5.5.
And how does that impact the economy? Because, obviously when you compare this to other countries, there is this instant comparison on how India is growing faster than, the rest of the world. You say that this is a trade-off that we should be willing to take, that compromise a bit of that, high growth figure for more stability.
Yes, because you see, stability today means that when growth picks up later, it will be a growth we'll see for multiple years. Anybody who studied economic growth in India for the last 2-3 decades has seen one thing, that, growth goes up for 1 or 2 years, and then suddenly inflation rises, the trade deficit rises, everything rises, and then growth has to be clamped down by rate hikes, and then it comes crashing down. You don't want that growth, that, you only see high growth for 2 years, then you see low growth. If you want to see high growth for many years, you need to start from a place of sustainability and make sure that growth is in a sustainable pace. And that is what I'm batting for this year. Let 2023 be the year in which macro stability is preserved, over which from 2024 onwards, high growth can take off.
Okay.
Now, in the economic survey, it was highlighted that there are some great things that are happening. For example, the public digital infrastructure, a push to manufacturing via PLI, some government capex, all of this, I'm not against it. It's great. I'm excited about it. But the truth is, all of this will have payoff in the medium term. I think 2023, what we call FY24, needs to be a year of simplicity, of stability, and then all the amazing reforms that we are doing and which gather pace over time will give us much better, higher, and sustainable growth over the medium term.
Now, Ms. Bhandari, there's a very important question that I am been wanting to ask you. We spoke to Mr. Subbarao, the former RBI governor. He'd also written a piece in the newspaper where he says that the concentration has to be on job creation rather than revenue politics, which directly has an impact on our budget. But do you feel that politically one must first settle the definition of this word revenue, because one man's revenue is the other man's welfare scheme, and both have budgetary implications? One thing is important, the other isn't.
Well, look, absolutely. I think it's all about efficient expenditure. How do you make spending more efficient? We've done that with food. We are trying to do it with fertilizer. We had a very big food subsidy for the last couple of years. When we realized it's not needed, we tried to restructure it, bring it down, but not dramatically. We sort of are phasing it out. Things have to keep changing. There are different calls for different periods. During the pandemic, you had to have a good social welfare scheme on food protection. We went through that. So look, you're right. I completely agree with you that this whole revenue term, it has to be put in context. And it sort of is has a different answer in different periods. I think for this particular year, with the pandemic behind us, I think it's all about making expenditure much more efficient to ensure that tax collections also become more efficient, and over time we are able to bring down our fiscal deficit.
Since you mentioned tax, I want to squeeze one more question in. Do you think that it makes sense for the government to go for tax cuts, or should this be rationalized? Because the chief economic advisor, the CEA, says that tax cuts of 2019 actually helped the private sector improve their balance sheets. So should that continue, or should this be revisited?
My sense is at this point, we should not really change any tax rates. There is a lot of importance in having stable tax rates. People make plans, and then the plans get disrupted if there are big changes in tax rates. So I don't think we should tinker with tax rates, particularly at a time when we want to bring down the fiscal deficit. But I think what we should do is, the finance minister had come out with this scheme of direct taxes, but with fewer exemptions. And that hasn't really taken off. I think it's very important to incentivize it. I think it will be a good idea for people to move towards tax rates with lower exemptions, because these lower exemptions over time have become loopholes. People in the same income bracket, some pay very high tax, some pay very low tax, depending on how you're able to work through those loopholes. So in a way, moving to a exemption-less, loophole-less tax regime of low and stable tax rates, I think that is something that should be incentivized, and I hope we see it tomorrow.
All right, Pranjul Bhandari, thank you so much for your time. Thank you.